In 1969, an outdoor exhibition was held in Jemaa el-Fna square in Marrakesh, and 2 weeks after, the exhibition took place in Place du 18 Novembre in Casablanca. And this project was actually made against the Ministry of Culture. What was this project about, and what was its purpose?
So the landmark street exhibition that this artist would call Manifesto Exhibition, so an exhibition thought like a statement or a manifesto, was entitled, as you said, Plastic Presence, Présence Plastique, which is obviously not an innocent title. So, you know, a lot has been said or discussed or interpreted around this kind of landmark, really, because I believe even in the recent years, throughout different museum discourse or symposium, that specific series of street exhibitions has been fairly considered as a major international event at the scale of, let's say, modernities from the South.
Yeah.
Or South modernism, and it entails a lot, and probably a lot more than what we can say in a few minutes. But the way those 6 artists gathered was mainly a reaction to the state of things with showing art in Morocco even after independence, which means that by creating this environment, or by creating this performative display, you know, showing real artworks
Yeah.
outside in the street, literally, was basically a response, and a quite aggressive, I should say, response, because it was in a very autonomous and a very radical, and without I wouldn't say without diplomacy, because they had a whole deal of manifestos and text explaining their project, but, you know, aggressively in a positive way, which is to impose yourself, basically, when the situation requires it. And at that time, they were just analyzing how the salon exhibitions and the French driven exhibitions of Moroccan art, even after 56, continue. So even in 1965, 67, 68, 69, even more than 10 years after the independence, it doesn't mean that the post-colonial revolution or cultural revolution has happened. It actually always takes an amount of time, a certain time of incubation, I would say, for cultural revolution to be produced from independence, but within a certain temporality. Yeah. That often took time. Why? Because basically independence, and I'm talking about all colonized countries, didn't mean that some of the cultural practices of colonialism would stop the day of independence. Yeah. They always continue until a certain artistic ecosystem from grassroots and local ground would emerge and basically subvert it. And that's what the Plastic Presence exhibition does. Because basically what these artists were doing in the Casablanca Art School from 1964-65 was obviously remaining somehow in the walls of the school and not necessarily visible to the country or to the social landscape and the social fabric, I would say. So that's why those different series and iterations of the Plastic Presence, this street display, which happened in May 69 on the Jemaa el-Fna square of Marrakesh, but then in June 69, the month after, on the 16 November square of Casablanca, and then later on in even more social places like high schools or even a psychiatric hospital by the beginning of the 80s, were all And of course, for the first one, the one of Jemaa el-Fna in 69, a statement and a provocative visibilization of what was still invisible because produced in the rooms of the Casablanca Art School, which is the street display manifests its own discourse, which is modern art can be art for the everyday. And modern art, through a popular canal, not only aesthetically for the influence of popular art, but physically for their integration in a popular and social landscape, is a kind of mise en abîme, which is you show work outside to show how art should integrate the everyday and how art should integrate the social fabric beyond where it's produced, which is a school, or where it should be exhibited, which is a museum, which actually didn't exist at that time. So the statement is very strong because it taps into different directions and considerations of the whole post-colonial situation in which those matters needed some visibility and needed some physical existence in order to produce their effect. And as they said a little later on, integrate, because then later on, by the beginning of the 70s, when they collaborate with the architectural studio Faraoui and de Mazières in order to produce artworks included or embedded in those hotels of Faraoui and de Mazières, they call it integrated arts or integrations.
Yeah. So here we have like two images of this exhibition, plastic presence. We can see actually that the works are hung on walls in the streets. Yeah.
Exactly. I think it's a good point because it's not, I mean, it is the street, but to be somehow maybe half street and half the feeling that you could get in a museum, actually. So it's definitely something hybrid to it. Maybe it's not comparable to what we would call street art from the end of the 20th century, because it doesn't have that kind of outlaw or illegal way with the very walls. It has something official, almost like a festival in the presence of these panels, as you rightly point out. And at the same time, it's also definitely outdoor. So the system of those panels, which was actually used before, because not only Mohamed Melehi used that panel system in his 1965 Bab Ruha solo exhibition, and you can understand it because Bab Ruha is not a white cube space. Bab Ruha is a traditional building from the 13th century, from Middle Ages, with bricks in relief, and therefore it needed something to implement the integrations of the artworks. So everything that's not a white cube, and there were no white cubes in Morocco before the very beginning of the 70s, with Galerie L'Atelier and Galerie Nadar, which will be among the two first white cube galleries, needed to be expressed in an alternative device, and those panels were also used in the first trio exhibition, which I mentioned in 1965 at the Mohammed V Theater Hall of Rabat, again, as a way of implementing the artworks, more than just showing them. It's about integrating them.
Really, yeah. And here we have two more images of this Manifesto exhibition. But this one took place in the girls' high school in 1971.
Yeah, exactly. It's very emotional, I would say, and very striking, the choice and the position for those artists to say art should be integrated to schools, you know what I mean? So something that nobody expected, you know, at that time. And even the testimonies and records that we have, fortunately, from the girls of that school themselves, how they reacted to the Casablanca Art School displays and how they reacted to their artworks, has been documented in the first issue of the Integral journal that was published in 1971. And it's an incredible step, I think, because you can see in those photos there is a sense of joy, simply, and there is a sense of community building and community making that should go beyond the institutions who define us as a student or a prisoner if you're in prison, or a sick a person if you're in a hospital. And that there is a certain sense of community building and thirst for creativity and visual arts that should define us as a collectivity beyond our strict social position or categorization. And that's why they also much later on experimented the same collective process and manifesto murals, not only for the Asilah Festival, but also in 1981 in a psychiatric hospital of Bereshid city.
The group of artists from the school of Casablanca issued a statement in the journal Souffle saying, I quote, "We wanted to engage the people where they are, when they are receptive and relaxed. And so we presented this living exhibition, paintings displayed in the open air in a public square." What was the local people's reaction when they saw this art in open air?
I mean, again, for the girls' high school, we literally have accounts from some of the pupils who actually comment it with much surprise, and a lot of them comment it as, I never saw modern art, I am not sure how I should look at it, or I feel that the space has been uplifted, or I believe that, you know, I'm very happy for the integration of these works. Then the Jemaa el-Fna Square and 16 Novembre Square between Marrakesh and Casablanca is kind of more difficult to grasp for the audience reaction and response. We have some clues and we have some bits of information. There are press reviews which are quite telling.
Yeah.
But the difficulty with that is that the press review is mainly the reflection of the journalist who wrote it, so not so much the reflection of people's impression. But I would say that even by looking at some of the photos, and maybe we should include more to the presentation, but just by looking to the photos of people from the street standing in front of the artworks on the Jemaa el-Fna Square or on the 16 Novembre Square, the curiosity, the engagement, and was very high, and there was nothing like indifference. And I think it's clear that the objective to overcome any indifference, you know, so what was important was maybe not so much the reactions, but the fact of reacting,
Yeah.
making sure that people would react either positively or negatively. And for that, I think it's something you can see on some of the archival photos that we can show, and some of those are actually incredibly telling. Because, for example, when you see a woman who has obviously a lot of weight because she's carrying a lot of bags, or even what she carries on her own body feels very heavy, but you still see her firmly standing in front of one of these paintings and taking time to look at it beyond the weight that she has on her shoulders or in her hands. Tells you a lot, and I believe there are a lot of small details like this that we can identify in those magnificent photographs taken by Melehi of people in the streets confronted to these artworks. It should be also mentioned that on these photos, specifically on the Jemaa el-Fna Square exhibition, for some reason the artist had to put some barrels, some iron barriers that created a border still between people looking at the works and the works themselves, which is something that later on in the Integral account, Melehi regretted and said that it was a shame that they felt obliged to use those metallic barriers between the people and the works, but that was somehow resolved 1 month later in Casablanca, where those metallic barriers don't happen anymore, are not there anymore. And the structure of the 16 November Square, which is more simple than the Jemaa el-Fna Square. Jemaa el-Fna Square is not so much a square, even if we call it a square. 16 November Square is a square. If you look at the display, the works are literally displayed around the 16 November Square, and you can very easily enjoy them just by this circular movement. Jemaa el-Fna Square is not really structured like a square. Jemaa el-Fna Square is a kind of, Deleuze would say, rhizomatic space with things happening in every corner of that kind of huge space that we call the Jemaa el-Fna Square. So it has a much more labyrinthic structure, and actually the artists were obliged to use the external walls of several blocks of the Jemaa el-Fna Square. Hence the necessity to also give a sense of track and path with the metallic barriers, which don't occur in Casablanca the next month. So there's so much to say about the display itself and about the audience, how the audience can move around and how they feel about it. And eventually, I think, a very fascinating idea of always including the debate or the critique or the comment into the process itself, which to me, again, has to do with cybernetics and a very interesting conception of social space and social interaction.
So during our conversation, you briefly talked about Asilah Festival. In the summer 1978, Melehi co-founded with Mohammed Benaïssa the Asilah Festival of the Arts in their hometown of Morocco, near Tanger. According to Belkahia, this was the first event of its kind in North Africa. So how did this idea of creating a festival come up?
Well, it's another very interesting story. At that time, 1978, when Melehi and Benaïssa came together, because they both from there, they both from Asilah, it was again a very social thing. Actually, the Medina, an old city of Asilah, was not in a very good condition, was quite, affected by time and by degradation. It's also a time when Melehi and Benaïssa will begin to organize politically, as unexpected as it can sound. They were artists because Benaïssa was a photographer, but they also converted their actions and activities. Again, we're up now to the end of the 70s, beginning of 80s, in the political agenda, literally by the elections and by contributing by a cultural association, which name was Al-Muhit, and basically took part in the city elections. And during that city election, for members of that small association led by Melehi and Benaïssa to maybe become city deputies, was the issue of convincing the inhabitants of a new artistic program that will be called the first Moussem Cultural Festival of Asilah, for raising consciousness around the preservation of the city and its heritage, basically the buildings and the city walls and white houses, so typical and emblematic of the north of Morocco, by artistic creation and by artistic collective actions, mainly embodied by the incredible murals produced by the most remarkable Moroccan artists, those I mentioned earlier, who are the Casablanca Art School artist fellows and companions, the Labied, Miloudi, Qatas, even Fouad Belhamine. I mean, if we want to be very precise, even Shaibia, the famous woman, self-taught Moroccan painter who apparently had nothing to do with the Casablanca Art School, was also invited to create murals at the Asilah Festival. The one that we see here on those images is one of the most beautiful one on the right side from Mohammed Chebaa. And the one on the left shows that people from Asilah, especially women and especially the youth, would be invited to create and experiment their own murals and frescoes, sometimes even in collaboration with the most remarkable artists who were invited for refurbishing the walls in a way through their murals. And that's the core, let's say, beginning and the core issues that led Melehi and Benaïssa to create and gather all that federation of artists, but also civil society. For example, here it's very interesting because we see Mohammed Chebaa at 10 years distance, creating one mural on one house's wall of Asilah in 1978 on the left for the first edition of the festival, and then 10 years later, literally the same block, same house and the same wall, but designed with his current aesthetics of the end of the 80s, because the Asilah Festival was still ongoing. So, it's something quite unique, because not only the festival still exists today, I'm not saying it's always as creative and as dynamic as in the 70s and the 80s, but it has the merit to still exist nowadays, and it's still running, and it's still providing the youth of Morocco, and especially from the north, with something they can experiment and they can engage, and they can renew their own conception of their city and how to preserve the heritage year after year. That a kind of muralism festival, if you want, of the third world, but also for South modernism, because the Asilah Festival was not only welcoming that specific event, it was also a really broad and rich and intense platform of living arts, theater, concerts, musics, and also workshops, actually engraving workshops led by incredible artists like Mohamed Omar Khalil, the Sudanese artist, or Nasser Soumi, the Palestinian artist, or you even had Etel Adnan, who traveled to the Asilah Festival. You had Mona Saoudi, who traveled for the Asilah Festival. So the Asilah Festival became an incredible network, an incredible platform of events and panel discussions and symposiums. There's need for a whole documentation of that festival. It has never been fully documented, and nobody really knows for now the scale of what has been achieved only for the end of 70s and 80s in Asilah. So So it's definitely something that we will work on documenting, inshallah.
Yeah. To conclude, Morad, I have one more question. How did the artists from the Casablanca Art School contribute to the foundation of a national Moroccan culture?
So the idea of a national culture, are embedded in a way, integrated, you could also say, or rooted, has never been conflicting for them with transnationalism
Yeah.
and a certain cosmopolitanism. So I would say that this idea of a national culture, as strongly as it expressed, especially in the first issues of the Soufl journal,
Yeah.
where it's very harshly expressed, like we need a cultural revolution to translate the independence of this country into something tangible and something productive as artists, writers, cultural producers. I mean, basically implementing the cultural agenda into a revolutionary change. And I believe that was done by Belkahia, Melehi, and Chebaa in an incredible, sensitive, and subtle approach, which has to do with their own aesthetics in each artworks, and also in the way they grouped their ambitions and were able to organize their ambitions in a collective endeavor at the school. And also, I think, if you want also to look at it more politically, within a clear post-colonial debate, which has to do with the debunking or the deconstruction of key colonial patterns which have led the aesthetic conception or the history of local arts, or the general managing and exhibiting of local arts under the French protectorate. So I would say it's really a kind of toolbox, or a kind of set, or a philosophical program that defines their kind of collective conception of national culture. It's not strictly national, but it has to do with very harsh grassroots conceptions from colonial time that needs a certain amount of deconstruction and revolution.
Yeah.
And everything that's also, beyond the national then has to be reintegrated into the national. So any cosmopolitan experience or widening of the spectrum to beyond Morocco also needs a certain amount of reintegration to the local and popular craft and craftsmen and local structures. So it's a complex definition, but
we would stay with this one. Morad, before relocating to Paris, you spent 5 years working at the Tate Modern in London as curator for Middle Eastern and North African arts. Why is it important for you until now to continue to work on Arab, but also Asian and African modernities?
I think from when I began this, and it's true that I began with the Tate Modern, even if I got interested in that slightly before entering the Tate Modern, and especially through Iranian modernism, which was my first impulse. And then I have to say, quite quickly shifted to the whole Arab, African, and Asian spectrum of modernities. Was really about a sense of rehabilitation. I don't look at it as if it was as simple or if it was as obvious. I always look, even if the process is made, I would say, easier nowadays, because protagonists like you and I and so many other colleagues of us who work in the field, in and out museums, have contributed so much to it. I mean, look at the MoMA volume of the Arab primary documents,
Yeah.
look at Rasha Salti and Christine Khouri's project about the Palestinian exhibition in the 70s. Look, I mean, you can name them all. So even if it's kind of easier now, you know, for all these contributions and all these implementations, I still tend to look at it as a kind of rehabilitation, as a kind of reparation for art history, because we're documenting and writing about things that happened and influenced people's lives, but were just not documented at the same scale or the same logic that Western museums have developed since, you know, the idea of the museum was born in Enlightenment, let's say, for the French, since the French Revolution. So for me, it's very much about this process of rehabilitation of history and rehabilitation of artistic practice and artistic trajectory. And honestly, it couldn't be a more exciting time, again, referring to all the incredible colleagues who do nice projects everywhere, and including the Dalloul Art Foundation or other collaborations that we had in the past. I'm always more confident in a way, and always more motivated, but I never lose the fact or the sense that we are repairing. We are not only curating, or there is a sense of reparation.
Thank you so much, Morad. It was so nice to hear you speak. Thank you for sharing all of these beautiful images from Mohammed Melehi archives. And I wish you all the best for your next project.
Thank you so much, Arthur. It was great to discuss in such a friendly zone, and I look forward to the final editing. And thank you so much for everything.
Thank you so much. Bye, Morad.
Bye bye.